Thank you very much. It's an honor that I've been invited here to speak about my teacher, Professor Sachidanand Ahmad. And only early this year, I made a small documentary on him, which is about 24 minutes. And if you're interested, you can always have an access to it. It's all there on YouTube and also on the website of the Institute of Human Geographers USA, because they supported me in filming this entire work. What I'm going to present here is based on the writings of my teacher and the kind of ideas, the kind of themes that he worked on. It's very important that we must remember Professor Ahmad not just a geographer and also a person of tremendous sensibility towards poetry, and Professor Atiya Habib Kidwai has already talked about that. I really do not know much about his poetry because my association with Professor Ahmad started when I became his student, a doctoral student sometimes in 79, and it continued, the association continued until the time that he was alive. Also because of the fact that when I was appointed in JNU as an assistant professor in geography, I was asked to attend his courses because that was the kind of a convention that if somebody has to take over, must attend the classes of the previous teacher, and that was the convention and you won't believe, I attended that class associated with that course as a co-teacher for nearly 6 years, and I got an opportunity to teach the course only a couple of times, and I believe Anandita is sitting here, and she would vouch for that I never taught in the class, but I was sitting and listening to my teacher. And that was also an occasion that it occurred to me that I should do something about the fact that there is such a rich material that Professor Ahmad presents in the class. And I'll tell you what it is all about. And there is very little that we have in writing. So why not just record everything that he was speaking in the class? Those days, I think the technology wasn't that advanced, and we were, some of us in our, I repent as to what really I did. Why did I destroy those cassettes? Because it was the only source where, you could hear Professor Ahmad speak. And those who have heard his lectures would vouch that, would certainly support the idea that he spoke such flawlessly. And his ideas, were just like, a stream flowing down the hill. So lucid and yet so intense. I'm not going to talk much about Professor Ahmad as a person or as a supervisor, because they're in a way reflected in that short film which I have produced already. We have established a fund in his honor, which is called and that has been supported by his students and his students' students. They are the ones who created this, and this fund is called Professor Sachidanand Ahmad Memorial Fund.
Many of them were not his students.
And many of them were not his students either, but they had just read his work or maybe heard about him. So it's an occasion for me to also thank everybody for having supported that venture. And that venture is all about promoting his ideas, and talking about his ideas and taking his ideas ahead. So it's based on much of writing that Professor Ahmad did, and what kind of writing and what kind of themes that he really addressed throughout his academic career. Let me say that I'm not privy to the documents or maybe his life in AMU, so I'm not going to talk much about it. But I do understand that when he completed his PhD on human geography of the Indian desert, I think he must have observed, and I haven't read his thesis, and that's my ignorance. But the kind of conversation that I had at different occasions with him makes me feel that certain ideas were brewing inside him. And it must have taken nearly a decade, from 62 to about 72, when he became part of JNU, that the ideas saw the burst, and it really saw the blooming of it. And we cannot really appreciate what Professor Ahmad did in his academic life without understanding his association with AMU, because until about that time, if I look into his writings, he's talking about so many things, but he's still searching for a kind of a theme on which rest of his academic career would perhaps develop. And he's talking about the deserts, he's talking about lives in deprived societies, communities, but he hasn't yet really thought about what kind of geography could there be which could really talk about all these things. And therefore, when I look back, I can only see that there are 4 important aspects that Professor Ahmad addressed in most of his writings without being very directly talking about it. But if you read his writings, you will perhaps understand what I'm really trying to say. And therefore, I would rather put the works of Professor Ahmad in terms of what I would call materiality, structure, and agency. Now, why I'm talking about materiality? In much of his writings, he is really basically talking about the material conditions of people's existence. Whether he was talking about a community in the Indian desert, whether later on he talks about the caste society, the hierarchical caste society, or whether when he looks at the question of the Indian tribes, on which he has a beautiful atlas, and so on and so forth. So therefore, one has to really appreciate his writings in the context and the kind of materiality that he's talking about in the context of JNU also, because JNU provided him, and the JNU life provided him with a kind of a possibility of having an interface with both in the class and outside, because the JNU academic environment was not confined to the classroom. And Professor Kidwai is there, my teacher, Professor Aslam Mahmood, they are both here. And I know that much of what we learned in the classroom were also being debated outside in the dhabas, and also with the teachers sitting across and sharing a cup of tea with them. Therefore, if one has to look into the works of Professor Ahmad, it is JNU. It is the 10 long years that he was really trying to come to terms to geography, in terms of what emphasis, what was that which was lacking. Can we really free ourselves from the colonial structure of geography? Can we really get rid of the Dudley Stamps kind of a framework and march into a different direction? And I think, that's what paid dividends, because of the fact that his association with Professor Munis Raza is much older than, his association with Professor Munis Raza in JNU, that we see much of the writings that, Professor Ahmad did, whether it was the Valley of Kashmir or the textbook that both of them they wrote on the textbooks for the NCERT General Geography of India, and the tribal atlas, the atlas of the Indian tribes. They were all co-authored by Professor Munis Raza and Professor Ijazuddin Ahmad. And therefore, I can't really say that it was Professor Ahmad's work alone, but I could see as to where Professor Ahmad was stepping in and trying to really talk about things, which was very close to the questions that he was really trying to explore. He was always an explorer of that kind. I would not be incorrect if I were to say that, Professor Ahmad is the founder of social geography in India. And a social geography of the kind that we cannot perhaps call it to be an indigenous variety of social geography, because this is the term. The Indian social geography or Indian geography is something that he always contested. If you see his presidential address of Nagi, there is really 1.5 page where he's trying to address the geographers, saying that please, for heaven's sake, get rid of this idea of creating an Indian geography, because there cannot be an Indian geography, there can be geography. And nowadays that we really talk about, when we talk about, indigenous knowledge systems, is yet another kind of a diversion that he was all through contesting. Although to say that he had no idea of what Indian heritage was would be absolutely wrong, and that will come towards the end when I refer to the opening page of his last book on Indian subcontinent, the first page where he quotes Iqbal, which I'll talk about later. When I'm talking about, let me get back to this idea of materiality. I think until the works of Professor Ahmad and Professor Raza, geographers in general were completely cut off from this idea of the material conditions of people's lives. If you look into the first demonstration of that in published form, I would say it was in several writings that he did, small articles here and there. His works on also modernization and also on Indian education system, because his association with education was one of the longest association besides all other things. Look at the chapters of his book, Social Geography of India, and look at the subtitles. If you look into the subtitles of each one of these chapters, you get to understand as to what was he really trying to say and how he organizes his texts. In fact, the opening introduction is all about the materiality at the regional level, borrowing from the personality of India of Subba Rao and several others, and he was one of them, who would just get into everything that would perhaps mean, in order to establish what he was really trying to say, that anything that he has written, rather Professor Munis Raza and Professor Ahmad, they are based on evidences, and they're evidences which in fact could be seen across, and they're all available. So when he talks about the economic modes, a social geography chapter beginning with the regional economic modes, I think that was the first time that, somebody tried looking at this question of the economic modes, and therefore he could understand as to, in the framework of Indian geography, where do the tribes stand and where are the castes, societies that they stand. So he made a very, very strong distinction, not a kind of a distinction where the two elements would not fuse into one another, that is the emergence of an agrarian society and the kind of a hierarchical structure, and that's where the structure comes in. So addressing a structure, that is the structure of social organization in a space, is something that he was not talking for the first time. Because even Professor Ahmad and Professor Raza had predecessors. You have people, like somebody who wrote the Spatial Organization of Kinship, Iravati Karve, which was one of the first geographical, not by a geographer, but a first geographical understanding of the kinship patterns in India. Also, although it was addressed from a purely Brahminical point of view, and when I'm saying Brahminical point of view, that it is based on the textual analysis of the Brahminical sources, not so much rooted in empirical work. But here, you have the advantage in Professor Ahmad's work on Indian social geography, where he talks about kinship, clan, and castes based on evidences from the field, and you have evidences which are coming not only because of his own field work, but also drawn from several anthropologists and sociologists and so on and so forth. Anybody who meant anything. In fact, he borrows extensively from the works of A.R. Desai, he borrows extensively from the works of Mandelbaum, whose work on Indian society is so very important for us to, in fact, understand Indian society. I would also remind everybody here that his doctoral supervisor, Prof. S.M. Ali, who in fact was a professor here, wrote a brilliant text based on the Hindu Puranas, which is the geography of the Puranas. Although he did not work himself, but you have a fairly good amount of information, and the way that information has been utilized in order to understand Indian society is something which one has to read in order to understand. So, if I were to say that in India, it was a kind of a paradigm shift in Indian human geography, a paradigm shift in the manner that not to discredit anything that others were doing, but here was a situation where an avenue was created in order where geographers could understand the spatial structure as an outcome of social relations, and social relations which are rooted in the structure of caste. Now, here it's very important for us to look at the materiality and the hierarchy that is the kind of a theme that he addresses. If you look into the text of the school textbooks, where there is a beautiful diagram, which he presents in General Geography of India, and I would just elucidate that in just one sentence. He says that you have the Brahmins, and you have the caste structure, which is in fact the Brahmanical class structure, caste and the class structure, because he's not trying to address just the caste. The caste and class association becomes more clear when you really bring in two indicators. One is the indicator of land, and the other is the indicator of labor. Who performs the labor, and who owns the land? If you have these two questions, then you could understand the Indian hierarchical structure. The person at the top would not own the land, but would not perform labor either. The second would own the land, but would not perform labor. The third would have partial access to land and would perform some labor. And at the bottom, you have no land, but perform all the labor. And the entire accumulation of material well-being of a country or a region is based on this vertical exploitation of the forces of production and surplus generation. So if you do not address this question, you cannot perhaps understand the Indian society, because the sociologist, talked about hierarchy in terms of statuses, but do not go about defining statuses in terms of their excess or deprivation as a consequence of land and labor. Land as a source of the physical capital and labor as human capital. You see them today in the present circumstances. The globalization has again created a similar situation of a conflict between land, that is the resources, and the labor. You can look into as to how we have what we call it a flexible specialization, or in the name of what goes around in the name of flexible specialization. So while Professor Ahmad may have had predecessors, and everybody has a predecessor, and in his case you had the works done by anthropologists and sociologists, and this association between the sociologists and the geographers goes back to the times of Durkheim and Waddell de la Blache, because they were struggling to find a place. Geographers are still trying to find a place where they lost the battle before Emily Durkheim, who is seen as a kind of founder of sociology on the world scale. The materiality, I'll come to the question of materiality into two more important works that he had done. And there are series of works. They are not just one or two works, but these are themes. One is the geographies of the tribes. Nobody has really studied the geographies of the tribes the way Professor Ahmad and Professor Raza have done. If you look into the Atlas of the Tribes of India, you would see as to how the theme of the tribes have been addressed. It is not just their distribution that really became important for him, but he was trying to understand as to what is the process which has unfolded as India embarks upon the path of development. What is this development like? What development means to whom? Which are the communities who tend to benefit and who are those who continue to be shifted onto the margins of Indian society? And therefore, I said my presentation today is all about the structure and materiality and agency, and I'll talk about agency a little later. If you look into the tribal atlas and his writings on the modernization of different communities or regional, different levels of the regions, you'll find that one theme that he goes on emphasizing time and again is not just the question of inequality in a way that many of us would like to understand, but inequality which is a function of a continuous process of deprivation and marginalization. And where do you get the evidences from? So you map the first, it was not the linguist who did this. A geographer, attempts to map Indian tribes on the basis of what they are receiving. In fact, it's an irony that where the tribes live are the areas which are extremely rich in mineral resources and forest resources. It's irony that you have the richest physically endowed areas where the tribes live, and yet they are the poorest of the lots. Where not poor in terms of just the kind of material poverty, but in terms of various other aspects of it, and that they continue to be losing out. We are talking about resilience. We are talking about sustainable development, and we tend to be understanding sustainability from the perspectives of the dominant classes, from the perspectives of the technocrats, from the perspectives of the people in power. We really don't try to understand where is the literature in India. When we are talking about indigenous knowledge system, do we really bother to in fact build up any kind of a knowledge based on what and how the tribes looked at their own resources? We don't have it because they are the elements of otherness, because they are the external to us, because they needed to be pushed out into the margins. And here was a geographer who was trying to stand with them and address the question from the margins. So it's not just a geography of the tribes, it's a geography of the tribes being addressed from the margins, not from the center. And when you address it from the margins, what do? You look at the question of what is the kind of shift or the change that is happening in the linguistic characteristics of the tribes. And here you have for the first time, using the Government of India data, that you have the mapping of the shifts taking place, linguistic shifts taking place at the district level. We don't want to look at those maps because we are overpowered by the glamour of the capitalist society. But that's where the doom of the capitalist society is also located, and I shall in fact come to that a little later. I'm not going to take, Madam Chairperson, I'm not going to take much of the time, another 5 minutes. That would save our organizers and that would save everybody have your lunch in time. So what it really meant? It meant that the language shift has taken place, where the Santals have lost their own language, where the Ho and the Mundari communities are continuously losing their language. Why are they losing their language? Is this shift taking place for the first time? No, it was not taking place for the first time, but it was not being studied. And what was the process through which, this shift is taking place? What does this really mean? And once, you try to really present a certain kind of an categorization that Professor Ahmad and Professor Raza did in their atlas, they have taken 4 types of what you call core and the peripheries. There is a mapping of the tribal core, there is a mapping of the tribal periphery. And if you look into those maps, which I have them, but I didn't want to present it here precisely because, sometimes when I make presentations through PowerPoint, the PowerPoint goes one way and I go the other way. So, I feel absolutely powerless. So that's why I can't really put my thoughts and what I am showing on the tribes, but on the maps. But what you get there is that there are communities who have been exposed in the name of development. From 1955 onwards, the kind of development that took place in the tribal areas, investment in extractive industries, did it benefit the tribes? You have an important piece written by Professor Raza in his article, Geography as a Social Science, where you have one para where, he makes it very clear. And that is what is advanced to yet another level where the investment in the mining-rich areas, has really created a kind of fragmentation of the tribal cores. And you have, areas which have been untouched by the development processes. And don't get me wrong, I am not against development, but I do not take any development given to us the way the powerful would like us to believe. And therefore, he looks at as to what happens in the core of the Naga communities. The Naga community who have detested any penetration from elsewhere, from the global capital, the core remains intact and the periphery is not visible. So the process of peripheralization is a product of this dynamics in the name played on the soil of India elsewhere through the kind of a capitalist domination in the process of development. The 2 small themes that I would like to mention, because talking about development, talking about deprivation, he talks about the scheduled castes, and he talks about the caste society in order to understand the scheduled castes, maps them, understand as to what is really happening with the agricultural laborers in different parts of the world, how the small cultivators among the scheduled castes are increasingly becoming wage laborers. They are getting displaced from the land, whatever little access that they had. And a similar process seems to be happening not just with the Dalits, as we would like to politically call them, but also with the tribes or the Adivasis. But you also have a very distinct category of India's population without whom we cannot really identify India. Unfortunately, the present dispensation in power doesn't understand that, are the Muslims of India. So talking about the Muslims becomes yet another preoccupation towards, in fact, later 80s of his life. Let me remind you that was not the first. In fact, way back in the 70s, when Zafar Imam Sahab wrote a book on Muslims in India, there was an article which Professor Raza N. Khan and Professor Ahmad contributed on the Muslims in India. He comes back to that in late 80s, and he produces 4 volumes. These 4 volumes were produced, funded by, I believe it was funded by Hamdard Jamia, and it was done in 4 important areas where the Muslims were preponderant. Muslims are not everywhere, but they are everywhere, but yet, there are pockets where they are preponderant. And how could we really understand the questions of the Muslims and their access to education, their access to livelihood resources, and but talking about Muslims in isolation is not the right way of doing it. So you really see a kind of a methodological shift, where he's talking about Muslims He's talking about other communities as well. And he's not discounting for any other community who could also be subject to various kinds of deprivations. And therefore, his understanding was that, we cannot really understand Indian society just through the medium of these traditional classifications based on religion, based on caste, but on the basis of the materiality, on the basis of the social structure, on the basis of what that social structure means to the spatial planners. And therefore, it is not just description of what you really see with respect to these communities, but how can we really translate our understanding into policies? So his engagement with policy matters has been something, where he really goes, he takes the understanding of geography to the level of the policy, the government policies. And there I think, he has made tremendous contributions, particularly with, what we popularly know in India as the Muslim-dominated blocks, for the first time, there was an attempt made somewhere in mid-80s where Muslim-dominated districts and blocks were identified. And some kind of a database was being created. Now, this database could not have been possible unless and until, one was in a position to make use of the census data, map it out, and engage with the policy makers. He was never a member of the Planning Commission because he was one such person. I know him very personally, and I think Professor Ahmad, Professor Kidwai, and Professor Aslam Mahmood would know him much better than I do. Because there is always a hierarchy between, and some kind of hierarchy. The word hierarchy, Professor Ahmad would hate. So I'm not going to talk about hierarchy. But nevertheless, there's always some kind of a line, invisible line, that is drawn between the teacher and the taught. And therefore, I never had the benefit of developing an understanding of Professor Ahmad directly by talking to him, although he was always available. Lastly, how do we understand Professor Ahmad? If we see Professor Ahmad as an research association with Professor Munis Raza, and all of you know that Professor Munis Raza was a declared communist. Is Professor Ahmad a communist? I would leave that to you. But if you read into his writings, then you'll have to think twice, because there is an urge for equality. There is a very sharp and an evidence-based criticism on deprivation and marginality. He is for modernization, but a modernization which is not equivalent to westernization, and modernization which could not be counterposed with, say, the kind of things that we are really talking about, West versus East and the Orient, but something which makes you feel that he is refusing as a scholar to be put in a particular box. He doesn't want a tag. That has been his urge. He doesn't want a tag. Don't understand Professor Ahmad, Professor Ijazuddin Ahmad, by putting in a tag, JNU wala, or putting him a tag, what do you call it? What is this company called, Tod Phod company? I don't know what is that term which the present government was using. Tukde, don't put him as somebody who is just simply a humanist. Don't put him in terms of just somebody who really appreciates the Indian diversity and wants to preserve it. But while talking about Indian diversity and preservation of Indian diversity, cultural and social, he is very clear that what we need to preserve and what we really do not need to preserve. He makes a very clear choice. But he is for federalism. He is not for concentration of power. He is not for concentration of wealth. He is fighting at every level in order to address this question. So a canonical thinking about Professor Ahmad would not help us understand Professor Ahmad. And there he was happy to contribute, but he was also very sad that all that he was really trying to do did leave a mark on generations of students, because I really do not know whether the curriculum of AMU at the PG level has a course in social geography. I really do not know. Okay, if it is there, very good. But today I know for sure that there are nearly about 30 universities and PG departments in India where social geography is being taught, in whatever manner that the teacher is really trying to translate his ideas. But it was this work and this gentleman, Professor Sachidanand Ahmad, who was solely responsible for creating and presenting before us and the generations of his students who would like to perhaps take a look at his works to understand what he meant by social geography. It is not just social equal to human or social as a subset of human. Social is neither precedes the human, because human conceals that social. So therefore it's very important for us to understand as to what it conceals. And therefore, why is it that in the last book, the opening page he writes, he quotes Iqbal. And that is something where I will leave that statement of yours, and that would be my last word here today. नानक ने जिस ज़मी पे वहदत का गीत गाया, मेरा वतन वही है, मेरा वतन वही है. Why Professor Ahmad had to say this? Isn't it irony that an Indian who was dedicated to the service of the Indian community, Indian polity, around 2004, when that book is published on Indian subcontinent, has to start a book saying that मैं उसी ज़मीं का हूँ, वही मेरा वतन है, जहाँ नानक ने कंपैशन और प्रेम का गीत गाया. ये कहीं ना कहीं हमको इस बात का याद दिलाता रहेगा कि हमने कुछ को बिल्कुल सिस्टमैटिकली अलग करने की कोशिश की है. अदरनेस के इस जंग में प्रोफेसर अहमद को याद करना बहुत ज़रूरी है, क्योंकि वो जंग उनकी किताबों में जो बातें हैं, जो विचार हैं, जो एक तर्क है और जो एक मेथडोलॉजी है, उसके बगैर समझना हिंदुस्तान को मुश्किल होगा. शुक्रिया.